Eren Yeager killed 80% of humanity. Captain America gambled with half of the universe. Yet audiences still trusted Steve Rogers while questioning Eren's morality. Why? In Avengers Infinity War, Steve Rogers refuses to sacrifice Vision, even after learning that Vision's death could stop Thanos immediately. Captain America says, "We don't trade lives."
We don't trade lives, Vision.
It is one of the most heroic moments in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But there's a problem. Steve's decision risks not just Earth, but half of all living things in the universe. And when Thanos finally snaps his fingers, billions disappear. Meanwhile, in Attack on Titan, Eren Yeager chooses the rumbling, an act so catastrophic that it wipes out 80% of humanity. And unlike Steve Rogers, Eren fully understands the horror of what he is doing. One character is remembered as a hero, the other becomes one of anime's most morally terrifying protagonists. But if we judge purely by consequences, the gap between them becomes strangely uncomfortable. So why do audiences emotionally trust Captain America while fearing Eren Yeager? The answer has less to do with morality itself and more to do with how stories teach us who deserve forgiveness. On paper, the comparison almost sounds absurd. Eren commits mass genocide. Steve Rogers refuses to sacrifice one person. The moral difference seems obvious, but the deeper you examine these stories, the less simple the comparison becomes. Because Captain America's decision was not small, it was not personal, it was cosmic. At the moment Steve refuses to sacrifice Vision, he already understands the stakes. If Thanos obtains the Mind Stone, half the universe may die. Not half of humanity, half of all life. Entire civilizations, entire planets, entire species. Steve knows this, and still he cannot bring himself to sacrifice his friend. Emotionally, the audience see this as noble, human, compassionate. But strategically, it is a gamble with unimaginable consequences. And the story itself eventually confirms this. Thanos wins. Half the universe disappears. So why does the audience still trust Steve? The answer begins long before Infinity War. For nearly a decade, the MCU carefully constructs Steve Rogers as morally trustworthy. Not perfect, trustworthy. There is a difference. Steve is repeatedly framed as selfless, principled, protective, and sacrificial. This matters because audiences rarely judge morality mathematically, they judge character emotionally. And emotionally, Steve Rogers feels safe. Even when he makes dangerous decisions, the audience assumes he must have a good reason, because the narrative trained us to trust him. This is what I would call narrative trust. And almost every scene in the MCU reinforced it. Heroic music, warm lighting, sincere speeches, emotional vulnerability. Other characters admire him. The camera admires him. The story itself admires him. Even his mistakes are framed as morally sincere. Steve is never presented as frightening. Eren Yeager is the exact opposite. At the beginning of Attack on Titan, Eren is easy to understand. He is angry, emotional, vengeful, but understandable. His mother dies in front of him. His world is stolen from him. And like many protagonists, his rage initially feels righteous, but slowly Attack on Titan begins changing the way it frames Eren. The more power Eren gains, the less emotionally accessible he becomes. He isolates himself, he hides information, he manipulates his friends. His face becomes colder, his dialogue becomes detached, his motivation becomes increasingly unclear, and eventually the story itself begins to fear him. Notice how differently the anime frames Eren during the rumbling. There is no triumphant heroism, no uplifting soundtrack, no emotional reassurance. Instead, there is horror, silence, colossal titans flattening cities, children crushed beneath the breeze, people screaming in terror. The anime is no longer asking us to understand Eren, it is asking us to witness him. And that changes everything. What makes this comparison fascinating is that audiences often value intention more than outcome. When Steve Rogers says, "We don't trade life," and emotionally, that statement feels morally pure, even though the consequences becomes catastrophic. Meanwhile, Eren says, "I will destroy the world," and emotionally, the audience recoils instantly, even before the rambling begins. But if we remove emotional framing for a moment, both characters are making impossible moral calculations. Steve believes sacrificing vision is wrong, even if it risks universal destruction. Eren believes destroying the outside world is necessary to protect paradise. One chooses hope, the other chooses certainty. One refuses to kill someone he loves, the other becomes willing to kill almost everyone else. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The audience emotionally forgives Steve Rogers because his morality feels compassionate, and fears Eren because his morality feels monstrous, not necessarily because the consequences are objectively easier to defend. This is where the discussion becomes larger than anime or superheroes, because stories does not simply show morality, they guide morality. Music, cinematography, dialogue, character reactions, all of these elements quietly influence how audiences judge ethical decisions. Imagine if the rumbling had been framed like an Avengers moment. Heroic music, inspiring speeches, emotional triumph. The audience reaction would feel completely different. And imagine if Infinity War framed Steve Rogers like a psychological horror character. Dark lightning, ominous music, other characters terrified of him. Suddenly, his refusal to sacrifice vision would feel reckless, possibly even horrifying. Because morality in storytelling is deeply emotional, and humans themselves are deeply emotional creatures. We rarely judge people objectively, we judge whether they feel trustworthy.
みんな何かに背中を押されて地獄に足を突っ込むんだ。大抵その何かは自分の意志じゃない。他人や環境に強制されて仕方なくだ。ただし 自分で自分の背中を押した奴の見る地獄は別だ。その地獄の先にある何かを見ている。それは希望かもしれないし、さらなる地獄かもしれない。それは進み続けた者にしかわからない。
What makes Eren especially disturbing is that Attack on Titan never fully excuses him. The story understands his suffering, but it never asks us to celebrate the wrongdoing. And that is important because Eren is not written as a pure villain. He is written as a tragedy. A person so consumed by fear, freedom, trauma, and inevitability. And unlike Captain America, Eren himself seems aware of this contradiction. That awareness makes him frightening. Not because he lacks humanity, but because traces of humanity still remain inside him. But maybe the most fascinating part of this entire comparison is that philosophy itself cannot fully agree on who was more moral. To a utilitarian philosopher like John Stuart Mill, Captain America's decision becomes deeply dangerous because refusing to sacrifice vision ultimately risks trillions of lives under consequence-based morality. Saving the many should outweigh saving the few. And suddenly, Steve Rogers no longer feels unquestionably heroic. But from the perspective of Immanuel Kant and deontology's ethics, Steve's decision becomes morally admirable, because to Kant, human beings should never be treated as tools for an outcome. You do not sacrifice innocent people, even for a greater good. Which means Steve's belief we don't trade lives is not just emotional, it is philosophical. Meanwhile, Eren Yeager represents the terrifying sides of pure consequential thinking. Destroy the outside world to guarantee paradise survives. Commit horror to prevent greater horror. And this is why Eren feels so disturbing. Not because his logic is incomprehensible, but because it is understandable. And history has shown us many times how easily human justifies atrocities when survival becomes the ultimate goal. But perhaps the philosophy most relevant to this discussion is not utilitarianism or deontology. It is virtue ethics. Aristotle believed morality is not judged only by action, but by the character of the person acting. And this may be exactly how audiences actually judge morality, not mathematically, emotionally. We trust Steve Rogers because he feels virtuous, compassionate, selfless, stable. Even when his decisions fail, his character feels morally safe. Eren, meanwhile, gradually loses that emotional trust. The more isolated he becomes, the more frightening he feels. And once audiences stop trusting someone emotionally, their actions begin to look monstrous, even before the consequences arrive. Maybe that is the uncomfortable truth these stories reveal about us. Humans like to believe we judge morality rationally, but most of the time we judge morality through emotion, through trust, through narrative, through fear. And perhaps this is why Captain America still feels heroic, while Eren Yeager feels terrifying, not because morality became simpler, but because storytelling taught us who deserve forgiveness.